Okay, so my name, as you heard, is Roxanne Spillett. I had the honor and privilege, the deep honor and privilege of leading Boys and Girls Clubs of America for 17 years. I was also on the staff of Boys and Girls Clubs of America and other leadership capacities for another 17 years. And so I have a lot of experience in that organization and in the sector in general. And I would say this, it's also an honor and a privilege for me to be part of the university here. I think this university is awesome, the students are awesome, the students I've had in my class that are here, you know, hello again, it's awesome to see you. And so I'm delighted to be here. And I want to share a perspective on this issue of social impact, which is probably not what you're expecting, but I think it's really important. It's about the role of leadership. And often we think about outcome measurement, and we think about program design, and we think about evidence-based programs, and we think about all of this, but we don't really pay a whole lot of attention to the subject of leadership. Now, we have leaders in this room, we have board members in this room, we have CEOs in this room, and to me, you can't succeed to the extent possible in achieving social impact without the right leadership. And so I want to devote my time, and I know there are many disciplines in here, you come from many vantage points in here, but I'd like us all to focus in my short time with you on what is the responsibility and the role of leadership in social impact. And so I want to just start my comments off in a different way. I want to tell you a story. And it is a story about leadership. And it is a true story. And a book was written, it's called The Last Place on Earth. Am I doing something wrong?
Oh, I just had you muted.
Okay, you want me to stick around here? Is that what you want?
You just try this microphone.
Okay, so, the book is called The Last Place on Earth. It was written by a guy by the name of Roland Hunsford. It's a very big book, and it's about a journey. And in 1911, this is a true story, two men set out on a journey. Two adventurers set out on a journey. Their journey was to be the first to step foot in the South Pole. That was their journey. And it was a race. One man's name was Admundson, another was named Scott. 1911, October, they set out on their journey. Two men, equal in age, equal in experience, two men in the same conditions. The conditions you and I could probably not imagine. 20 degrees below zero, gale force winds, no means of communication. Two men set out on a journey. One's name was Admundson, another's name was Scott. The outcome for these two teams of adventurers was very different. And that's what I want to talk about. And so, Admundson, he had a philosophy about leadership, although I'm sure he didn't call it that. And his premise was, I'm going to learn everything I can to help me anticipate what I'm about to endure, what my team is about to endure. And so he biked from Spain to Norway by choice. He wanted to get in shape. He tested the idea of eating raw dolphin as a source of energy if he should ever need it. He took a pilgrimage to the land of Eskimos and lived with them and learned from them how to dress in the ice and snow, how to work in the ice and snow, how to survive the elements, how to use dogs as sled dogs. He spent months with the Eskimos. That was Admundson. Scott, on the other hand, chose to prepare differently. He did none of the above. He didn't have any knowledge necessarily about the way Eskimos lived, and he didn't make his pilgrimage. He didn't do what Adamson did. Now, the outcome for these two gentlemen, matched in experience, matched in age, matched in like conditions, is very different. One team declared victory. For another team, it was a devastating defeat. What made the difference? And so, if you look at how Adamson prepared, he also decided that it was going to be important to mark his journey as they were reaching the South Pole. So he planted flags. He and his team of 5 men planted flags every quarter of a mile. And every 8 miles, they planted a black flag for contrast with the snow. He brought 4 thermometers with him, just in case 1 breaks, 2 breaks, 3 breaks. He had a 4th. Scott, well, I would say too, Adamson brought 3 tons of food planted in strategic places. Scott, 1 ton. Adamson had 5 men. Scott had 17. And so the journey began in 1911, October, and Adamson's team successfully reached the South Pole in December of that year. Scott left at the same time. Remember, the same time, the same journey, the same environment. He arrived there 34 days later. When Adamson arrived, they planted the flag in the South Pole, and he returned his men safely home. Scott arrived, absolutely devastated to know that Adamson had been there more than a month earlier. He turned around without markings on the journey home. They lost their way, they ran out of food, and all of them perished, found frozen to death. 2 men, same journey, same conditions, same experience, different outcomes. And so I ask you this. What made the difference? Okay. The difference is, very simply, in a word, leadership. And I maintain that social impact, although not as exciting a parallel, but perhaps a even more important one, leadership is going to make the difference in an organization. We can talk a lot about outcome measures, we can talk a lot about program design and evidence-based. We can talk a lot about that. But if we don't have the right leadership, we're going to achieve different results. Okay? So that's what I want to talk about today, leadership. And I want to explore a couple of questions. And those questions are, what is social impact? Everybody will have their definition. I've got mine, and I share it with you because it helps me think about, as a leader, what the implications are of social impact for those who lead organizations. Why is it important? What will it take to achieve social impact, in my view? And what is the role of leadership in assuring social impact? So I think I have this clicker. Okay, so let's start with this question, what is social impact? I have 2 definitions up here. When I ask people what they mean by social impact, they usually say something like the first thing, the effect of an activity on the social fabric of a community and the well-being of its individuals and families. And that seems reasonable, that seems acceptable, it seems right. But the more I got into this as a CEO, into the subject of leadership, I realized that that definition wasn't adequate enough to help people understand what has to happen in order to make social impact a reality. And so I chose to look at it in a slightly different way, and others have too. The definition I like best because it's directionally right and frames our challenge in a way is that social impact is what we aim to affect, the results that can be directly attributed to the outcomes, the planned outcomes of specific and intentional program or collection of programs. What the second definition is saying is that we need to be intentional about the outcome that we are seeking to achieve. And so I choose the second one. You may have a better definition, but for me and for this conference, I think this idea that we're in charge of outcomes and we're in charge of programs that get to social impact is the real point here. I also believe that social impact requires and is a new way of thinking. It is a sea change in many ways to the ways in which most nonprofits operate today. A sea change, nothing less than a sea change. So nonprofits today, and this is not a criticism, this is a reality, and this is the way nonprofits have operated for a long time. They think of their job often as meeting needs. We have to change that. We need to think about our jobs as making a difference. Meeting a need is different than making a difference. Second thing, in the nonprofit world I grew up in, we did a lot of counting. We counted people. We counted participants. And now we're not talking about counting participants, we're talking about getting a result. We talked in my growing up in the nonprofit sector about anecdotal stories, and they are wonderful. They make you cry, they make you understand in the depth of your soul the value of a nonprofit experience. We used anecdotal stories to make a point, to, quote, prove our effectiveness. Today, that's no longer enough. Today, using relevant data to drive decisions, improve outcomes, and prove impact is the way we need to be thinking. Lastly, or next to last, in the nonprofit world, you kind of pick a problem and then you pick a program to resolve that or address that problem. In the world of social impact, it's not that simple. You select an evidence-based program, a program that is promising or evidence-based and have the greatest potential to achieve impact. And the language that we have adopted at Boys and Girls Clubs of America that describes the change we need to make is moving from outcome intended, we intend to produce an outcome, to outcome driven. We're going to drive an outcome. And that drive and outcome is a key role of leadership in an organization. And so that's kind of the way, social impact has changed the way we think. And that little chart there kind of describes the change, the sea change in thinking that has to take place across the nonprofit sector. Why is it important? Well, you know and I know, this is a simple question. The problems, they're so big. They're so big, the educational problems, the problems of obesity, the problems of poverty, they're so big and they're not getting smaller. We've got to do something here that's going to make a big difference. Maybe not alone, maybe not the nonprofit sector alone. Nonprofit, public, private, we need to be working with government. So the idea is the needs are so big and we are a big sector, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. And the resources are small and getting smaller. And you know and I know that the world we live in today is different, and that the resources that were once there may not be there in the same volume they were before. We know on the supply side, the money side, that budgets are under pressure. We know about the looming issues that local government, state government, and the federal government are going to face, and its impact on the sector. Less money, significantly less money for government-funded services as well as the nonprofit sector. And so we know that foundations and corporations have different ways of doing business now, particularly corporations. And we know that even individuals with the new tax changes are wondering, about their discretionary dollar. What impact are these changes going to have? And this is not a political statement, it's a reality. What impact are the changes in our taxes going to have on my discretionary dollar? And so the supply side, money, is shrinking. At the same time, the needs are exacerbated and growing. And you know that. You see it in your towns, you see it in your communities, you see it on the streets. Okay? So the bottom line is, if the supply of money goes down and the needs go up, people aren't going to get served, which is my number one concern. But second, there's going to be fierce competition among nonprofits for very, very limited resources. So at the same time, you have the supply and demand issue, but you have to realize this nonprofit sector in this country is huge. It's huge. We have nearly 1.6 million nonprofits. We have total revenues of $2.1 trillion in annual revenues. And we, the sector, are 10% of the United States workforce. If we can't make a difference, a bigger difference than we're making, we've got an army here. And if we focus them right and lead them right, they can make a bigger difference. And so that's kind of why. And the time for change, we're not too late. We're not too early. The time for change is now. And the leaders in this room, the researchers in this room, the practitioners in this room are at the leading edge of a change that has to take place. And so it's my great hope that out of this conference comes a little more momentum and a lot more knowledge and wisdom about this idea of social impact and the way in which we need to lead and the way in which we need to program and plan. So the time for change is now. We see it already. The investments, particularly of foundations at this point, but also I'm hearing it certainly from corporations, tell me what difference you're going to make, certainly from individuals, what's the ROI, return on investment, for my contribution? We hear it all the time. So increasingly, investments are being made where there is a return on investment, where there is a measurable result that demonstrates impact. Board members, and we have some board members here today, boards are asking the question, tell me more about what difference you're going to make. I used to work with a board member, a very smart guy, super smart. His name was Gary Fernandez, and he was a number 2 at EDS. And I would tell him something, and he would say the same thing to me all the time. He'd say, so what? And I'd say, excuse me? He'd say, so what? I said, do you know how many clubs we opened? In 1 year? We opened like 200 clubs this year. And he'd say, so what? And I'd say, so what? What do you mean? And he would say, so tell me what difference you made. And that's the line of questioning and the line of thinking and the line of action right now that we need to be pursuing. What difference are we making? Boards are asking that question all the time. Most important, the nonprofit sector, given its size and scope and resources, needs to be a bigger player and make a greater impact with the resources they already have. And lastly, why the time is now, we're all accountable. We're accountable to our organization's boards, we're accountable to the people we serve, we're accountable to our donors, we're accountable to our country, our community, to really make a difference. So the time for change is now. Okay, so what, and this is my view, what is it going to take to really, really make a difference? Now, I come at this with my own practical knowledge. I come at this having known Mario Marino and his book, which I think is extremely valuable, and I hope you will take the opportunity to read it. And I take it also from somebody who has taught me many, many, many lessons in leadership, and that's Jim Collins, and I'm sure you recognize that name. One of the foremost business writers, authors in this country. So at the heart of what really will it take to deliver social impact is this new way of leading, is moving an organization from outcome intended, I have intentions to get an outcome, to driving an outcome with all the intentionality and all the energy that they can apply. It requires a new way of planning and measuring. It requires a new way of managing performance. And when I say managing performance, a lot of times performance management in a nonprofit is not really geared at social impact. So what should our performance objectives look like at all levels in the organization if we're going to lead social impact? We should be accountable for the impact that we're trying to achieve. Often, if you look at our performance objectives, and they don't really address impact. They should, they must. And it also requires a new way to collect and use data. Okay, so there's a lot of discipline that's required in a performance-driven culture. The first, and organizations, nonprofits are just learning how to do this. With a great degree of discipline, they have to clarify their outcomes. What is it? What are the changes they're seeking to make? What specifically are they trying to achieve? And then they need to identify research-based outcome indicators so that they know that they're on the right track. So if you want to set out a goal of high school graduation, what are the intermediary research-based outcome measures that you can track so you know you're making progress towards your goal of high school graduation? Identifying evidence-based programs. You know, this idea of picking a program that sounds good, that's just what it is. It sounds good. But the idea of picking a proven program that's got some kind of track record in delivering outcomes, something that's evidence-based, we have a greater chance of success. Developing a system to collect data, using data not just to prove our effectiveness, but to navigate our outcome-driven programs to assure we're getting the results, and to make changes if we're not. It's a way to navigate to outcomes, not just prove effectiveness. And it's also about allocating resources. You know, when we build our budgets, how do we allocate adequate resources in order to assure that we are going to be prepared to deliver and drive those outcomes, and aligning the organization in its entirety behind the outcomes it seeks to achieve. Those are really essential if we're going to manage and if we're going to lead a performance-driven culture, a culture that drives social impact. And this is just kind of a scheme that kind of puts it all together, but when you think about social impact, again, it's all about identifying those outcomes. It's about identifying outcome indicators and collecting data and moving it to the point where the data you get is helping you to make decisions about how to get greater impact, how to change the course if need be, and ultimately how to arrive at really achieving significant social impact. And so what kind of leadership is needed here? And this is really the essence of what I want to talk about. What kind of leaders? And when I say leaders, I mean leaders at all levels. At the board level, at the CEO level, surely, the senior leaders in the organization, and leaders throughout the organization. We need, in the nonprofit sector, courageous leaders who will foster this notion of performance culture, who will walk the walk. Talk the talk is good, walk the walk is what we need. Who will bring leaders who bring clarity to the entire staff of a nonprofit sector about what are the overarching measurable goals of this organization. Leaders who expect that the objectives within every department are going to be connected to those large, overarching, measurable goals. Leaders who are obsessed with talent, and this is a big issue in the nonprofit sector. We all have big hearts, but you know, we have to look at our team and decide if they're the people who can move us forward. You know, we had one example, and you'll hear from her in a little bit. We tried and tried and tried and tried to get at this outcome measurement thing, and we went nowhere. And finally I said, there's nobody in-house that can do this. We need new talent. We need a new way of looking at this. We need a way where we can democratize outcome measurement and make it available to all of our 4,000 clubs. We had to go outside for talent, and you'll hear a little bit more about Elizabeth and what she has done in terms of our outcome measurement thinking, our culture, our system. So a CEO and leaders need to be obsessed with getting the right talent and aligning an entire organization around the goals and using data to make sure they make good decisions and improve the outcomes they're currently getting. So when we think about leadership, you know, absent leadership, who drives your social impact? Who's the big picture? It doesn't belong to a program person. They are an important part of it. It doesn't belong to your training and professional development department. They're a part of it. It belongs to the entire organization, and it's a responsibility of leadership to make sure the organization focuses on outcome measures. Okay, so just a perspective of mine that the framework for planning in the nonprofit sector, yes, everybody knows you create a vision, everybody knows you create goals and objectives, but for the most part, that is where planning stops. Okay? Leadership looking to achieve social impact has much more to think about than the goals and the objectives and the vision. They need to understand what organizational skills are needed and where it's lacking, where are the gaps, and how are we going to fill them. They need to understand the partnerships that can help to advance social impact. But they also need to think about the human resource issues. Do we have the right people? Do they have the right skills? Do we have the talent we need to deliver on our social impact goals? Systems and structure. Do we have a data collection system? Do we have a data management system? Do we have the systems we need in order to pull off this notion of social impact? Do we have the financial resources? And are we understanding the great and significant marketing implications and the resource development implications of social impact, which are great, I might add. So finally, I want to get back to our friends, Admonson and Scott. And so if you looked at some of these characteristics that separate Admonson from Scott, those are the same characteristics that separate business leaders, effective business leaders, from marginal or ineffective business leaders, particularly in very tough and challenging times, the kind of times the nonprofit sector is going through and will continue to go through. So a couple of observations about these behaviors from the standpoint of leadership. Discipline, fanatic discipline. That's what Admonson had. He had extreme consistency with clear goals and clear expectations, and he was unyielding. He had what's called empirical creativity. He didn't invent solutions. He tested things first, right? He went to live with the Eskimos. He made his decisions based on empirical data. He tried strategies that were based on empirical data. Scott, he brought ponies and motorized sleds that were never tested in the elements. And you know what? They didn't make it either. This idea of productive paranoia, understanding that things can go wrong, they will go wrong, but understanding what those
dilemmas might be in advance and planning to mitigate them is all part of the behavior we saw with Adamson. Fanatic discipline, empirical creativity, and productive paranoia. Those terms, by the way, coined by Jim Collins, are what characterize the difference between leaders, between Adamson and Scott. Leaders who reject the idea that forces outside their control will determine their results. Leaders who accept full responsibility for social impact, or whatever their journey is. I would say that we have a job to do in the nonprofit sector. We need to think not just about incremental change, but about transformation. That's our job. It's not incremental change, it's transformation. It's not an old way of doing business, it's a new way of doing business and a new way of thinking. And it cannot succeed without the right leadership. And so I hope for all of us, when we think of this idea of social impact, we think of the science, which we'll learn a lot about today, but we also don't forget the art of leadership that will make all the difference in achieving what we can and must achieve for our kids, our elderly, our communities, our country. Thank you very much. Questions? 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 Thoughts? Yes, Bernice.
Roxanne, first of all, I want to say that I'm in total agreement with everything that you presented, not just because it's personal opinion, but because from the work of my company in helping nonprofits demonstrate ROI, the very same leadership qualities that you talked about are the leadership qualities that were found in those organizational leaders who really took the idea of demonstrating social impact seriously. So they're right on point. I'm sitting here with my jaw dropped, amazed. So thank you for that. My question is though, another thing that I know about the nonprofit leaders is they will pretty much do what their funders require. So I'm wondering what level of leadership education will be important for the funders, particularly in the private and public arenas.
Yeah, that's a great question, and Tom really addressed that in some of his remarks too. You know, sometimes our donors are simultaneously our best friend and our worst enemy. You know, we tend to, all of us, well, let me not generalize, but many people in the nonprofit sector who raise funds, you know, are willing to, you know, kind of make accommodations for donors. And if donors don't understand what's needed in order to bring about social impact at an organizational level, they're not likely to fund it. And even if sometimes they do understand it, they think it's your responsibility to get it done, you know, without necessarily any incremental funds. Just reallocate your resources. Well, there may be something to that, but, you know, in the nonprofit sector, and fundraising is something believe me, I've been heavily involved in that. And I think there are, you know, far too few donors that A, understand the kind of sea change that's required, and B, even if they understood it, they're not inclined to fund it. They want their dollars to go to program. So we have to find a way to educate donors. I think Mario is doing a good job, but I think we all need to kind of climb the tallest tree and yell the loudest. Thank you for bringing that up. Yes.
This is Nancy Eichler, and I've got a question that I don't exactly know how to phrase, but it might fall under the general categories of complexity and emergence. And what I was wondering about is, what do you do when you're looking at a situation like, let's say poverty in your community, and there's not a research-tested model that you can just drop in? You know, do you run a risk of downsizing your vision so that you can collect data? Do you know what I'm saying? Or do you run a risk of having a leader that's so intent on reaching the South Pole that they're not taking into account other voices or emerging solutions. So that's, if you could just comment briefly on that, that would
So,
be great.
if I understand it, the choices you have to make when the answer isn't obvious. Is that
Right, and when somebody hasn't actually developed a program someplace else, because maybe we're just not there yet, or maybe they have, but it's not possible to take it from their community and just drop it into your community.
Yeah, and I think for for many practitioners, when you look for the body of evidence about solving poverty, which in and of itself is like beyond comprehension, you may have to pick a part of the issue and kind of take that elephant one bite at a time. So, if you look at poverty in this country, it's not like anybody's really come up with a big solution here. But there are ways in which, if you look at financial literacy, for example, as a category, there are some proven and tested programs in various aspects of this big poverty issue. So you might have to keep your eye on the big, the big goal. But when you select your measurable outcomes, you look for parts of proven and tested programs that have made a difference, these outcome indicators, whether it's financial literacy or education, and start to begin to plan in that way. You know what I mean? It's kind of building toward the big question. That helps. Oh. Questions, thoughts? Yes, sir.
Hi, this is Alan Card. You were starting from a large existing organizations, pretty dispersed across the country. I was wondering if you could speak to the challenges of getting all of your constituents on board with moving to this sort of approach.
Yeah. This Boys and Girls Clubs of America is, a significantly large nonprofit that has local affiliates. So the question is, how do you manage that? And, the answer is carefully focus, say it, spell it, say it again. We have literally, taken our, first of all, honestly, we have a lot of work to do nationally first to get our act together. And so we've made lots of headway and we're continuing to do that in terms of talent and structure and all those things below the goals and objectives. But simultaneously, we're mobilizing and we have mobilized our training. We brought Elizabeth in, you'll hear from her, somebody who is making it possible for the smallest of our clubs to measure outcomes and do so in a way that will help them dramatically manage better and get a result. And so it's a slow process, but we've learned that we can move the movement and through training, through technical assistance, through a whole lot of coaching. And our movement is ready for it. They know what their donors are saying. Now, my view is we should be at this because it means we're making a difference. That's the number one reason. But I'll tell you, the power of money and donors speak loudly. So the wind is at our back here. Yes?
I'm with Armin. I had a question about selecting outcomes, and I'm wondering, in your experience with the organization, about the potential for different stakeholders or constituencies having different understandings of what the goals of the organization are, and how leadership involves negotiating.
Okay, so if you have people in power that have different ideas than you do about what, I think if we think about this as evidence-based, and so when we selected our outcomes for education, and high school graduation, and I'm trying to think of the word we used to describe it, our intermediary variables, our outcome indicators. We went to an organization called Child Trends. Child Trends had done so much research on this, so basically we asked them, and we also went to Johns Hopkins Dropout Center, we asked them what works.
You know, if we're tracking high school graduation, what should we be looking for? Johns Hopkins research says it's ABC. Kids who are attending school, kids who are, or let's say kids who are not attending school are at risk, we're gonna monitor school attendance. B, they have behavior problems in school, that's what we're gonna monitor. So I think the idea of bringing different people together, and they have different points of view, is probably right. You know, many board members will say, why don't you just, you know, get their grades, you know, get their GPAs, you know, that's all you need. But what we want is what speaks loudly is what research has demonstrated to be true, and I think that will be your biggest ally. And I think more. I have one more question. Yeah.
It seems to me that one of the visions of the Boys and Girls Club would be to produce, or at the end, have children who become thriving, self-sufficient, self-assured adults.
Right.
You may not know that for 10 years after they leave your program. So do you settle with measuring things that you think will lead to that? I mean, when you have this vision of helping people become, that you may not see for 10 years.
It's kind of like a poverty question. You know, there are certain things that lead to productive, responsible, caring citizens, which is essentially our mission. So if you look at it from the standpoint of what are the things that contribute to that, and also, by the way, what are the problems that are pervasive and significant that need to be addressed, and where do they match? We settled on 3 issues. One was high school graduation. Another was healthy lifestyles. And the third was, and this will seem odd to you, but civic engagement. You know, we people who, in our world, young people who don't have the experience of civic engagement, chances are not going to have a voice. You know, the voice belongs to them, but if they don't exercise it and they don't know it when they're young, they can't be advocates for themselves. It's harder to when they're adults. So those are the 3 things that we chose, you know, that advance directly the mission of Boys and Girls Club. And most missions will be broader than your strategy. And some small organizations or some very focused organizations, they may be one and the same. Okay?
Roxanne,
Yeah.
can I use that for a second? I just want to add one thing to that, because I think that's a very important question. We hired a man to teach a course on social outcomes, and he used his legalization program in San Francisco as the measure. And one of the reasons he wanted to do that, legalization for some families takes 2 months, and for others takes 8 years. And he actually wanted that program to get us to break the idea that your best social outcomes could be 2 months after you've finished working with a family or an individual or a community. And he said that gets in the way of some of the more proper measures. So especially for those of you who are with organizations that have a long time battle, he's encouraging us to try to start looking at those measures so that we can actually get more affirmation for some of our programs, or criticize some that you're never going to get there. But if you only measure it by 2 months or 6 months out, you're really limiting some of the things. One of the statistics I didn't share with you, we went from 3.5 to 13 million clients during the development of the Rust Belt, but we still have 8 million clients. So obviously other variables, new opportunities, new education, new training, new jobs, liberated some people. That's some of the more hardcore. They're the ones we have to focus on. And it's going to take years. So I just think you've introduced a topic that's one of the things we should keep researching, because even for-profits in their 90-day mentality for measuring profits has just caused us so many problems in our economy.
Thank you, Tom. The one other lesson that I learned is that it's important that we understand that this social impact should not be composed of spending 95% of our time in measuring an outcome and 5% in getting it. Okay, so, we have to find a way to make outcome measurement, simple and contained. We need to be spending 95% of our time achieving impact, 5% measuring.
Thank you.
Thank you.